Good afternoon, everyone. This is Barb Tyson hosting another great Salty Dog webinar. Joining us today is Kevin Ferrie presenting information on successful offshore fishing. I'll ask everyone to keep video off and to keep muted. There is a chat box open. Go ahead and type your questions right in there. We do record all Salty Dog webinars, and I'm going to send out a link as soon as we have that ready. I'm going to hand things over now to Alex Helfand, our Salty Dog Education Coordinator. Alex just completed a transatlantic crossing, so let's all congratulate him on this great accomplishment. Alex, it's all yours.
Oh, thanks, Barb. Yeah, we just completed a 20.8-day Atlantic crossing from the Canaries to Newport. And as I was telling Kevin just before we all got together, we had lures out for a number of days, and nobody was interested in biting any of our hooks. So very, very, very much interested in hearing more about what we can do perhaps differently, or maybe it's a function of where we were sailing and just the fact that there was nobody home. Anyway, just a little bit of background about Kevin. He's a retired Coast Guard officer with 20 years with the Guard. He learned his offshore fishing as a kid and really grew up around that, starting out around Port Canaveral. In 2018 and 2019, he and his family did some cruising. They were part of the rally down to the Caribbean in 2018 and then stayed down there through 2019. And as Kevin was saying to me, he thinks of himself as more of a fisherman as opposed to a sailor, although he's obviously capable as a sailor since they got down to the Caribbean. So I'll say very little more and pass it on to Kevin and see what we can learn more about how to effectively fish off our boats. So yours, Kevin.
All right, thank you, Alex. I am monitoring the chat, so please, if we could talk for an hour about many subjects within offshore fishing. I have an outline, but I'm more than willing to vary based upon the interest on what people want to hear about. So I'll start, and please, I'll try to take questions as they come up. So does everybody, you hear me okay, Alex? I see you in the corner. I'm good, okay. Yeah, we were just talking before about Alex and how most sailors, when you're doing some voyage planning, you'll look at predict wind, and you may do, route planning on the pro model. So it shows you with the winds. You might look at, call Chris Parker and look at adverse eddies coming out of the Gulf Stream and stuff like that. And my wife, I let her do that because she was learning and she loved to do it. I was studying bathymetry, bait, upwells, and sea surface water temperatures to analyze where the fish are, and she'd come up with a plan, and I'm like, no, we can't sail there. We're gonna have to go here. And I say that tongue in cheek, but it truly is one of the biggest things is location. And I spoke a lot about location. In September, we did a seminar. I'm gonna just touch on it briefly, but I'm happy to answer specific questions as we go along. Let me make sure my slides. So this is a slide, I like to say this up front, and I help a lot of cruisers fish. But you really have to understand, people are like, why can't I fish like you? And I'm like, well, I'll burn fuel, I can do this. And they're like, well, I would never do that. So you really have to think about your commitment level. And if I were doing a transatlantic passage like Alex just did, I might not consider that a fishing trip because it's a long passage and you have to watch weather windows and weather rules, but I'm still going to troll lines. But now my expectation is that if I catch a fish, it's bonus. And if I'm trolling or sailing and I have lines out and I see a frigate bird up high circling, looking at bait, I might alter course. I will alter course, a few degrees to go check it out. But I don't expect to catch anything. Or if I do, it's like, it's good luck. It's like, all right, that happened. Cool. So let me make sure these slides scroll. Okay, so 3 keys to success. I truly believe these are the 3 keys. If you understand and can look at these, it's all that really matters. And we could talk about what knots to tie and how do you rig lures. None of that really matters as long as the knots don't fail, right? So I don't like to teach people that because there are 1,000 ways to do it. And 1,000 of them are right. But location, having the proper equipment, which is not equal to best, it doesn't have to be super expensive, but it has to be adequately sized and in good condition. So that way, if you hook a fish, you're not breaking things or breaking lines or losing the fish. And then presentation. And what I mean by presentation is, how do your lures look? If you're in the right location, you have good gear, and the lures look like something that a fish is going to eat, a fish is going to eat. So it's really kind of that simple, in theory anyways. So location, I only have one slide on location, and it's this one, and it's focused obviously in the Atlantic Basin. The graphic on the left is the prevailing currents. Like, these are the currents, with the Labrador current coming down out of Canada. That's the cold water current in blue. You could see the Gulf Stream, and that kind of circles around. It's called the North Atlantic Gyre. And if you study migration habits of mahi-mahi or marlin or wahoo or tunas, the fish you want to catch, they by and large follow these patterns. And you can see with the sea surface temperature chart on the right, you can really see that cut, off Atlantic where it gets cold. And anyone who sailed the Atlantic seaboard knows that, right? And when you'll only get good fishing north of the Gulf Stream if a warm core eddy, which you could see about halfway through, this warm core eddy starting to form, spins off and moves to the north. That's when the fishing gets really good off of like Long Island, New York, and other places like that. But outside of that, you really have to get into the warm water if you want to catch a mahi-mahi or like yellowfin tuna. The bluefin tuna, they're more cold water fish, so they can tolerate the cold water. So with location, and what's very interesting in this is what I really look for is areas of upwelling. The ocean is very deep, we all know, and typically what happens is as stuff dies, it'll sink, and it sinks down and to the bottom. It takes a long time to get there, but sunlight only penetrates so deep into the water column. So you need that sunlight for photosynthesis, and you need nutrients and sunlight together to start photosynthesis, which starts, the food chain basically. So I always look for areas of upwells. And for me, in the Eastern Caribbean, some of the best areas of upwellings have been the eastern side, the east edge of the islands, because the water dies and that water is floating across. The currents are slow floating across from Africa at that point. You can see it's at the bottom there, NEC, that's the Northern Equatorial Current. I was a physical oceanography major in college, so I geek out on currents. So you can see the Northern Equatorial Current moving towards the Eastern Caribbean there. So when that hits the shelf, it forces the water upwards. It's called an upwelling, and brings those nutrients into an area that can support photosynthesis. And that's where the fish hang out, because that's where the bait is. So that's a high level overview, kind of like a high pressure and low pressure system in the atmosphere. There are some natural areas of upwelling where the water like diverges and water comes up to replace it in the middle of the ocean. And you could subscribe to sea surface remote sensing sites and pay money, and they'll give you these areas, and the fishing is better there. When I'm sailing across the Atlantic, I just hope I run into one. I don't use that. I don't use that in route planning. But that's kind of location. That's the gist, is, you need areas of productive water, because frankly, you see around this current, it's called the Sargasso Sea. It's because it's kind of dead water, in that STG zone. Not a lot of water movement in there. So typically that's kind of like a desert, not a whole lot of fish there. All right, equipment. So that's the next key, and we'll talk a little bit about this. Forgive me, I don't know, a lot of different knowledge levels. So if this is too elementary, forgive me. These are two cents. I just went on today, and this is tackledirect.com. I use them. It's a good website. You can order stuff. There are others. And here are two fishing rods that if I went on your boat and saw them, I would say, yep, these will work. And you can see there's a 10-fold difference in price, right? One's $140 for the rod and reel, and one's $1,300. So that's what I mean. Equipment doesn't have to be expensive. Aboard Serendipity, our sailboat that we cruised on, I used hand lines. This is one of my actual hand lines that I fished on, and I caught a wahoo over 60 pounds on this hand line. I've also broken off some big, like I've had a marlin eat this hand line and broke the leader of the lure. But all it is it's like 200-pound or 250-pound mono, and you could see how I've crimped a swivel on there just to hook the bait onto. And this hand line, if you buy a hand line, a lot of people have the rubber bungees, and if you have them, you know what I mean, for shock absorption. I didn't use any of that. The other end of my hand line looks exactly like what you see there on the sole of my sailboat. So what I use flatline clips, and I'll get in and show you to show when I have a bite, because a lot of times, you know, if the bungee's tight, you know you have a bite. But there are other ways to do that, and there are 100 ways to rig hand lines. So I use 2 hand lines and 2 fishing rods. So I actually fished a 4-line spread behind my sailboat. And it's a little tough, but not too bad after you get used to doing it. So here's a little bit about rods, right? There's different types of rods. One's a conventional, what they call conventional rod and reel or boat rod, and one's a spinning rod. I carried both aboard the sailboat, but the spinning rod was, you know, for in the anchorages and having fun. And the conventional rod was from trolling. It holds a lot of line. I think that's the key there for conventional rod and reels, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. There's 3 types of conventional rods or reels that you may run into. The Penn Senator, that's like the classic. They were fishing Penn Senators in the movie Jaws in 1970, whatever. And they're still great. They're great reels. And then you have the level drag and you have level winds. And what I mean by star drag is what drag is. If you've never heard the term drags, that's how much pressure or tension it takes for the line to get pulled off the spool. So when a fish hits, if it's a bigger fish, you want the line to slip so it lets more line out. And that's what drag is. And in a star drag, I don't know if you could see my cursor, but just inside the handle, and I see a question about a hand line, Alex. I'll get to it as soon as I finish this thought. You see the star drag there. You just turn that to tighten the drag. And then the lever drag, the drag is actually here, and it's a lever, and it gives you macro and micro adjustments of the drag. And then the level wind has that piece in the middle that moves back and forth on the reel to put line on the spool straight and evenly. And honestly, that's the one reel that I wouldn't recommend if you're buying a new one. If you have it, it's fine, but it's a worm gear in there. There's a worm gear, so you'll see it. And it's just more to break, frankly. And if you catch a wahoo or a big marlin, they're very fast. That will be moving quickly and it can jam up and cause problems. And Alex asked, how hard is it to haul in a fish with a hand line? That's one of my, it's not hard. It depends on the fish, right? The biggest fish I caught on a hand line was about 60 or 65 pounds. It was a wahoo. That was hard to fight. And the biggest problem with a hand line is safety, in my opinion. You know, have a knife ready to cut yourself free. When I fish my hand lines, once I start pulling the hand line in, I either put it on the yo-yo reel as I pull it in, which is, you know, this red reel, you can just put it on there, or I'm very careful not to move my feet once I start pulling it in, because you don't want your ankle or foot to get in a wrap of the line if it's a bigger fish and it takes off. It just it's a safety issue. So you have to be prepared for that. But I've only had, that fish was pretty hard to reel in, but it was like a 5 minute. And you could just drag them, frankly. I didn't drag it very long. As soon as it hit, I started pulling it in. But if it's too big, just drag it until it's tired. I did see once we were eating dinner outside and we were just pulling a line, and it was down in the Eastern Caribbean behind one of the islands in deeper water. So we're in the lee of the island. It was very calm. And my son goes, "Dad, there's a marlin in the baits." And we looked up and we're all eating dinner and we watched this marlin, probably 300 or 400 pounds, come up on our hand line, eat the hand line, turn, and just broke my leader. And we're like, we didn't even get up. We're like, yep, okay. Because that would have been, I would have cut it free. I mean, there's no way. I'm not Ernest Hemingway and Man in the Sea. I'm not going to fight that fish on a hand line. But that's very rare. So these are 3 types of rods or reels. Honestly, for starting, like the Star Drag reels are great little reels, Penn Senators. They're affordable, they work, they hold plenty of line, the drags are smooth. And that's probably all you need. And here's the rods that go with them. This is like, a lot of people ask me what's an ideal offshore system. A rod, short and light, right? You want it easy to move about the boat. So I think like 5'6" or 6 foot is a standard length rod that actually I found to be work pretty well. 30-50 or 30-80 weight. That's just the jargon that offshore rods use. And a 30-50 is designed for line test of 30 pound to 50 pound. And then a lot of them are 30-80s, which is 30 pound to 80 pound, which would be a little bit heavier than a 30-50. They do make some 50-80s, but you should size your rod and your reel as a system. So they are all, you don't want a 15-pound reel capable of handling like 15-pound line test and an 80-pound rod, because the rod won't bend. You won't put enough pressure to bend the rod. For the reel, you should be capable of holding at least 400 yards. I like about 600 yards minimum. If you're under full sail and you hook a decent fish, they're fast and they can take a lot of line really quickly. And the way you can do that is there's monofilament, and that's the traditional fishing line, the clear line that you see. They make braid line as well, which is stronger for a given diameter. So it's a lot thinner. So I would load up my reels with 500 yards of braid, and then I would put a mono top shot of about 100 yards to 200 yards on top of that. And you need the mono because braid it'll cut you. It doesn't stretch. It's really difficult to work with under load, like if you're trying to pull a fish in. And you need the stretch of the mono when a fish bites when you're trolling at 6 knots or 7 knots. And if anybody has any questions about that, I could talk to them offline. You can email me and I can help you get set up with that. And the other benefit of using braid is that the mono UV degrades pretty quickly in the Caribbean. So you have to change your mono out. But if you have mostly top shot or mostly braid, then you just have to change a little bit of line. So it actually ends up saving you money in the long run, because the braid can be pretty expensive, but it can last 15 years on your reel. Ideal reel 4-to-1 gear ratio. That's just for every crank of the handle you get 4 turns on the spool, and so it's just easier to pull them in and out. It's just a quicker gear ratio. And it's like they do have 2-speed reels where you can actually change gears, and it might be 5-to-1 and 1-to-1. So if you had a hard fish, you could drop the gear ratio and it makes it easier to pull in, almost like going in a 4-wheel drive on a car. Although I fished for 2 years in the Caribbean and I did not have two-speed reels, and it was fine. And then capable of 25 pounds of drag pressure. That means that if you put a scale at the end of your line and you pulled and the rod bent and you pulled at 25 pounds of tension, the reel would slip. So that's about what you want if you're hooking a big fish. And you never want to fish, if you're fishing 50-pound test, so the line is designed to break at 50 pounds of pressure, you wouldn't want to fish 50 pounds of drag. You want that safety factor. So you want to set that drag at like 20% of breaking strength. So you'd set the drag at 10 pounds of pull, but then you can always increase it during a fight up to that 25 pounds if you needed to. And that's kind of the ideal offshore setup if you're going to fish rod and reel. The next one is bait presentation. I just want to talk about, and these are actual cruiser friends of mine tackle boxes that I went through last year up in Maine. And you see all kinds, right? So, you know, if you're in the right location where there are fish around and you have decent rods and reels that can handle the fish, the next thing you not got to do is give them something that they want to eat. So that's what this is about. And I'm going to go through just a couple of lures that I use and how I do it, and some hints that if you like, if this is complete Greek to you, I have a couple of lure recommendations that if you order them, they come rigged, and I fish them a lot and I catch a lot of fish with them. And so that is great for someone who doesn't fish much. And anyone who's cruised probably knows what this is. This is the trusty cedar plug. They make them in 4, 6, and 8 inches. I like to fish the 4 and the 6-inch models, depending on what I'm fishing. A lot of them come rigged, so you can just put this on a swivel on a line and throw it out there. And it's designed, it's got that weight on the head, so it darts back and forth. It's designed not to skip out of the water. It should stay in the water, you know, not most of the time. If it skips out once every, 30 seconds or so, that's okay. But this is designed to be fish in the water. And it's called a cedar plug, and they're great. They catch a lot of fish. And if you just want to go out there and have a chance at catching a fish, this will absolutely give you that shot. This is my next favorite. Well, might even be my favorite. This is a small lure. Tormentor makes this lure, and it's called the steelhead. And you see, you can order them rigged or unrigged. The purple one's actually not rigged. You don't see the line in there. And for another $1, you can order it rigged, and they rig them pretty well. And this thing has caught more fish. And I've used many of the colors. It's small. It's only about 4 inches. And if you fish it way back along the eastern islands, the blackfin tuna, which are all over the place, are shy of the boat, and they love this lure. And I'll fish it 100 yards behind the boat, like pretty far back behind the boat, and it works magic. So, if I'm talking with a new fisherman and they have 2 lines to run, I would say fish a cedar plug 100 feet back, 150 feet back, and fish something like this further back. And you never want to fish 2 lines the same length, only because if you make a turn or something, they're tangled. So if you fish them different lengths, they won't tangle when you make turns. Here's some other type lures that you may or may not have in your tackle box. These are, I call them squid skirts. They're just plastic, and they wiggle and they make pretty good action. If you look at the green one on the left, it's got like almost like a nipple on the front. They come like that. You just cut it off, and you can rig your line right through the middle of it. And I have some photos on how I rig these in a little while. And you can see I put an egg weight there in the photo, because if I want to weigh it down, you can buy appropriately sized egg weights and just slip them into the head of the lures and then run your leader through that egg weight, because there's a hole through the weight. So that's, one of the ways. And these things can be effective and they're cheap. The only downside to this plastic is if, you're in barracuda country or anything with teeth, they'll tear these up really quickly. And so you'll go through them pretty quick. Here's some of my lures that I fish. 2 of them are Islanders. It's just a manufacturer of lure. You could see that the one thing about these lures you'll look at is their hair. It's like Mylar hair and not plastic. So the benefit to that is when the fish bite them, they don't tear them up quite as quick. So they last longer, but they're like 5 times the price. So you could just decide what you want to do. Those are different shape heads too, I put in the photo. The one on the left is like a bullet shape head, and it's designed to fish under the water. And then the one in the middle is like a square, or that's a conical head, and it actually has jets in it, and it's designed to like smoke and create a big bubble trail, and that's designed to pop out of the water. And then the one with the plastic skirt, I don't know if you could see it, but that head is slightly slanted. So it fishes with the cup, the slanted side down, so it actually dives in the water, and then the line pulls it up when the fishing line gets up, so it goes up and down fishing, so it'll pop out of the water about every 10 seconds or so. So those are just different types of lures that all can work. I've caught fish on everything here, but I just kind of want to explain the difference in some of the lures. And then the best of both worlds, kind of, this is like a squid skirt, and I rigged an islander over top of it, because the hair is great because it lasts longer, but the plastic is great because it really moves and looks like a tail when you're swimming, so it actually has more action. So sometimes I'll rig stuff like this and just get creative. When we're out sailing, we have plenty of time to think and be creative. Here's just a few pictures in rigging. These are the type of crimps that you use. Aluminum crimps is the best crimp to use if you're running monofilament leaders. And then these are 2 types of swivels that I'll put on the end of my rod and leave the swivel attached to the rod at all times. And then it makes it easy just to change baits. And when you start fishing, you open it up, put on one of your pre-rigged lures, close it up, and start fishing. And the one on the left is bigger. It's ball bearing, and the other one is not ball bearing. And these you don't go through. I'd recommend ball bearing swivels. Are a little more expensive, but you don't go through it. And Douglas just asks a question: can you crimp effectively without a special crimping tool? It's best to have a special crimping tool, and I had a fishing one, but honestly, I use my Anchor electric crimping tool sometimes, and that worked just fine. And in a pinch, you can absolutely crimp with pliers. But I do typically have a fishing crimping tool, which you can buy for, like, the cheap ones are $19, $20. You can spend $200 to $300 on them. And I would recommend, not spending a lot of money on that. And frankly, there's other ways. I'll show you. I didn't crimp very often because I fished a different type of leader that I'll show here in a few minutes. Only because I was trying to simplify my fishing when I was offshore. I didn't want to carry a bunch of different gear on board. So I tried to really simplify it. So here's some of the leaders I was talking about. I would show you how you rig some of these. This is called a stiff rig. It's 2 hooks, and that's just shrink wrap that you shrink wrap over the hook, kind of just tie it all together. I actually bought that stiff rig just as is from Tormentor. So you could just buy them pre-rigged if you want, or you can rig your own. And you can see I don't even have chafe gear, which I should in this rig. At the crimp at the fish eye, that's just the leader, and I'll just double it up for chafe. But this was probably, I was in a hurry when I rigged this. And then the beads, they're little plastic beads you could buy, and all those are our spacing beads that set the hook. If you're fishing an artificial, you want the hook not exposed, but at the end of the lure. So you'll use spacing beads so that the hook is at the right position. And this is probably, I wish I had that lure is probably 10 inches. It's not a small lure, but you could see it's been beat up pretty good, and it's got quite a few bites on it. And then you could see on the right, that's how I would end it. So I'd have these rigged, and that does have proper chafe gear on it, a little thimble. And then I can just pop that right onto the swivel and just switch out lures easily and to fish. Is that the next one? You can also use these split rings on the left. They come in, pull strength, 135 pounds for that pack. So as long as it's, bigger than your fishing line. What I fished a lot is this piano wire, and you can buy this anywhere in the Caribbean. It's single strand fishing wire, and you can tie it just like I showed there with, they do make a tool that helps you tie it like that with a haywire and a barrel clasp is what that is. The haywire is like the wires crossed like a float hanger, and then you finish it off with a barrel. So I would always fish this stuff. One, because I didn't want to lose lure, so I fished this because of wahoo mostly, because their teeth are just nasty and they'll break through mono, cut through mono pretty easy. But the negative side to this piano wire is once it kinks, it loses its strength. So you have to continually recycle it. But it's pretty easy to work with. Probably not for everybody, but that's what I use just for ease of use. And like I said, that's why at the beginning I said there's 1,000 ways to do this. This is what I did and it worked. So this is bait presentation 101. The photo on the left is the flatline clip that I alluded to using these. I had 3 or 4 of these on board, and my hand line, I would tie it to a cleat, the hand line, and then I would tie the flat line next to it, and I'd put my hand line in that flat line, and it's designed when a bite happens, it pops, and you'll actually hear it pop. You hear it as it drops and hits the fiberglass. So you know you have a bite. And I liked it because, you know, if you have a bungee cord and you get a bite but don't hook the fish and you weren't watching, you never knew you had a bite. But with a flatline clip, once it pops, you know something pulled on that. So you can check your lure. You can set it. They're adjustable tension. So if there's a lot of sargassum weed, you could set it so if it picks up weed, it might pop the clip. So then you know. So I fish these clips a lot. They have other benefits that I'll hit in a minute. But this graphic here from Gulf Coast Mariner, I found this a while ago. This is kind of your average 4-line trolling spread. And in my boat, the ones on the inside were actually hand lines, not rods. But this is kind of what I fished. And the key is not the lures here, and it's not you have to fish 4 rods. It's distances to the boat, right? So if you're just fishing 2 rods, you would consider the 2 and you would stagger the distance as those 2. And what that does is, well, it provides what looks like a school of bait. You know, they're different distances swimming together. And it allows you, if the wind's blowing, for them not to tangle if one gets blown into the other one or if you take a turn. The other issue for flatline clips, which is why I fish them, if you were beam reaching and the wind was coming at your side, the wind will actually create like a bow in your fishing line, so it can cause havoc. And you can use these flatline clips to hold, and you can see in that picture, it's holding it down close to the water line. So then it controls that bait for presentation, and it allows you to fish in windy conditions without tangling your lines. And if the bait if you're fishing it and you're going fast and it's popping out of the water a lot and you look at it and you're like, if I were a fish, I don't think I'd eat that. Well, you can use that flatline clip to lower the angle of the line, and then all of a sudden the lure's not popping out of the water as much. And coming out of the water is good. Fish eat flying fish, right? So like if it comes out of the water, but it has to look natural. And with experience, you can look and say, yeah, I like that bait, or no, it's not right. And you can use this type of clip to control bait presentation. So here's a few of my actual bait spreads that I used. We haven't talked about ballyhoo. These are natural baits. Ballyhoo, they're dead, that I would catch in the Caribbean, and I would rig them up. And you don't need to do that. What that allows me to do is, you know, if a fish bites it, but I don't hook them up, I can free spool the reel and let that bait sink, and it'll come back and eat it because it actually had a real meal. So it gives me a second shot at fish, which I have hooked up many fish on second shots. But that would be like a typical 4-line spread, any of these two. You know, the one in the middle is no natural baits, no ballyhoos are what I might fish. And the one on the left has ballyhoo, and that's the one in my hand is just showing you the size of that tormentor lure that I can highly recommend. And if you notice, with the ballyhoo, I have the pink and white tormentor there that shows you the size of it. And with the non ballyhoo baits, I have that pink and blue tormentor, and I always fishing something like that, or a cedar plug in my bait spread. And this is my cooler, and I could go out and catch these baits, and I would catch them a couple nights before and just freeze them in packs of like 6 or 8 in our freezer, and then I have them for fishing. These are just some hook sizes, typical hooks that I recommend for trolling. These are J hooks, and I recommend J hooks for trolling, not necessarily circle hooks. You'll see all types, but circle hooks are designed. If you hear them, they're awesome hooks, but they're designed for the fish to swallow the bait like a live bait, and then as you put pressure and pull, the hook comes out of the mouth and stomach and lodges in the corner of the mouth, so they never swallow the hook. But if you're doing 6 knots and a fish is attacking your lure, it doesn't have an opportunity to swallow the hook. So these are probably the better hooks to use. So those are my bait presentation pictures. The one thing we haven't talked about is boat speed, and that comes up a lot. I think 6 knots is probably where I like the action of the baits. Like, okay, we're going 6 knots. We might get some bites here. 8 knots is even better. 10 knots is adequate. Tournament wahoo fishermen catch fish at 15 to 18 knots. So that's, if you're catamaran surfing downwind, as long as your baits look good, don't despair. But when you get under 4 knots or so, the baits kind of start limping and they don't look super lively. And that's where like using a natural bait like ballyhoo might help. Or, everybody has probably those swimming plugs with the big lips, the rapalas that dive down. That's maybe an effective bait to fish at slower speeds where you wouldn't want to fish one of these trolling lures. So those are other options that you can use. I have other slides that are hidden that I can show. So if anybody has any question, I was asked to keep it to 45 minutes. We're at 40 minutes. So I don't want to get into too many topics, but if anybody has any questions about, fish landing or ciguatara poisoning or fish identification or anything, I can certainly answer those now. I wanted to leave time.
Yeah, Kevin, can you speak to the ciguatara?
Sure. Ciguatara is interesting. I'm scared to death of it. It's a fish-borne poisoning that is heat stable, meaning that cooking the fish is not going to kill ciguatara. It actually comes from a dinoflagellate, which is a small zooplankton that lives on the reefs in temperate and tropical waters, more tropical waters, warm waters throughout the world, really, but it's very geographically specific. My biggest recommendation, it bioaccumulates in the food chain. So, small fish eat it and then the bigger fish eat it and get that, and it bioaccumulates up. So it's the apex reef predators that are at highest risk for ciguatara, which are your big groupers, your jacks, jack crevalles, amberjacks, your barracudas, mahi, and wahoo, and these offshore tunas. Fish typically won't have ciguatara. They're very, very rare because they don't feed off those reefs. So they don't really, it's not really high risk. But I'd recommend talking to you like hotspots in the USVIs. The southern coast of the USVIs and BVIs is a hotspot for ciguatara, but the northern coast of the BVIs and the USVIs is much less risk. So talk to the locals the biggest thing is understand the difference of what a barracuda is or a king mackerel that could have ciguatera and a wahoo. Like, don't accidentally eat something and then end up getting sick, because the symptoms of ciguatera are just awful. And it's Cig, Cigua, A-T, I forget how to spell it or something. I'd Google it, just have some awareness of it before you start catching fish. Is that okay?
Great, thanks.
Yeah. And what to do about sargassum collecting on line baits and lures. That's a tough one. In the Eastern Caribbean, there's a lot of sargasso weed, and there are times when I give up fishing. Um, and if you're single-handed or you have to be the one on watch and nobody wants to watch the lures, typically when we fish, my head is backwards and my wife's is forwards. So I'll watch the baits when we're in sargassum. Certain lures, cedar plugs, are notorious for catching weeds because that hook is just out there. So if there are times I'll just stop fishing, or I'll fish the baits closer in, or I'll fish less baits. But really, it's something that kind of got to deal with. So I got two questions that are about the same. Best way to kill the fish once on board, and recommendations about landing a 30+ pound fish. Obviously, once a fish is over about 10 pounds, I'm going to use a gaff. I assume everybody knows what a gaff is, but it's a hook with typically a 3-inch throat or gap. 2 to 4 inches, 2 to 6 inches really, but you should, about 3 inches is a good size to have on like a 4-foot pole or an 8-foot pole that you can reach out and you hook the fish with it, and it basically stabs a fish, and then you can pull them on board. I always gaff towards the head. That way, like if you gaff in the tail and the head gets, the fish gets spun around and it kicks in the water, it can take your gaff with you. But if you gaff in the head and keep that head coming towards you, if he flicks his tail, it's going to actually help you pull the fish aboard. So those are just little tricks. But the one thing that I do is once I land a 30+ pound fish, I try and keep the gaff in the fish and just put the gaff on the ground. So that way I have positive control of the fish. And not all fish are different. I mean, wahoo and tunas are not very flexible. So their tail will go up and down a little bit, but they're not going to beat your boat up. But a wahoo's teeth, if you look at a wahoo, and I can pull one up maybe as I'm talking, if you look at their mouth, or I'll pull it up right after, they're super small teeth and they will hurt you. So you want to keep their mouth away from everything. So I usually stick their mouth in the middle of or like against something, not near anyone's feet. And here's a wahoo mouth. Let me see if this will open up. I don't know if you can see this. So that's the mouth of about a 30 or 35 pound wahoo. And what you can see is its jaws are scissored. So they actually overlap, and those are micro teeth. They're super small teeth, but they're razor sharp. So they will absolutely hurt. So I always keep, if I'm catching a wahoo, I don't worry about it beating up the boat because it's not flexible. It won't beat anything up, but I keep the mouth away from all people. Where like a mahi, they're like flexible flyers. That's why they jump so much, and they'll beat a boat up so bad. So it's very careful. I'm very careful with a mahi once I gaff it to keep it on the gaff. But they don't have teeth. So like if it gets loose, I just kind of jump on top of it and wrestle it. And it happens occasionally. So I try and pin it with a gaff. You can use a tail rope on big mahi. I've just like had a tail rope ready, which is just like a slip knot to put around the tail and hold it by the tail, or even tie it in the davits I've done before. There is like right on the forehead, and you could Google this. I don't want to talk too much about it. There's a soft spot behind the skull where you could drive a knife or a spike into, and it'll paralyze and kill the fish really quickly. Alcohol in the gills. I mean, I did keep a spray bottle full of alcohol that we could spray on the gills, and that does okay. So that's an option. But the reality with my biggest worry is a wahoo's mouth, as you could see, just keeping it away from people. And then big mahi that just can flop and flip all over the boat, just spread blood everywhere. So I really try to keep positive control on the gaff and then kill it quickly. Are there any other questions? Fishing tips for coastal Maine, going there this summer. I'm in Scarborough, Maine right now. So if you want to hook up, look me up. We moved off our boat in September and we're from Maine. As far as fishing tips for coastal Maine, that graphic that I showed earlier on water temperature, it holds true. Like if you're going from A to B, I wouldn't even recommend trolling in Maine unless you're going really slow, and you might be able to catch a striped bass going slow with like a small lure or something. But there's so many lobster pots up here, if you haven't been, that it's kind of tough to troll. But if you want to go dinghy fishing, I would recommend a sabiki rigs, and you can Google that, SABIKI. And they're rigs, and they have tiny hooks on them, like 4 or 5, and you can catch mackerel, small mackerel, like 10 inches long with them, and then you can use those for striped bass, like for fishing in the dinghy or something. If you just want to catch striped bass, that's really the type of fishing I did in Maine. And then guides for fish identification. It's actually on my list to write a guide, because I don't know of any great ones, but I do have a slide on that. Let me see if I can find it. Maybe. Okay. So these are the 3 that you care about in reality. Like these are the prized eaters of the ocean. Mahi, which are easy, right? They're green. It's the only green fish in the ocean, or maybe not, but the one you're going to catch offshore. And here's some that you can read. I'm not going to go over this. Wahoo and tuna are members of the scombrid family, which is what phylum or genus scombrid, I think. And they have finlets. So a finlet is these little tiny fins under my son's hand. You could see them on the top and the bottom. Those are finlets. And only tunas and mackerels have finlets. And you can also see this wahoo that's on the deck of my sailboat. You can see what I mean. When I gaff a wahoo, I put the mouth on the leeward side of my well there. So that way, as the boat rocks, nobody's going to get in the way of his mouth. But that has those finlets as well. And they have forked tails, right? You see that very strong forked tail. And that's built for speed, where a barracuda has a fan tail. A lot of people confuse barracudas with wahoo, which is designed for like turning and maneuvering on a reef. So forked tails, the marlins, the billfish have forked tails. The barracudas and other fish don't. And a wahoo has those really pronounced vertical stripes that will fade as they die. That fish is still alive in the picture. So in terms of fish identification, yeah, I don't have any real recommendations, but I certainly can look and follow up and or help you if you have any questions. Any other questions? Like I said, I have a ton of slides here, so I probably can answer it. But I wanted to just focus kind of on a few things today.
Kevin, in the fall, when we're sailing down to the Caribbean, when would you suggest we consider putting our lures out?
That's a great question. So the fish do migrate up there, and king mackerel, which is a member of the mackerel family and actually relatively good eating if you eat it fresh. You don't want to freeze king mackerel, in my opinion. They migrate up into the Chesapeake Bay, and so do cobia, which is a brown fish that almost looks like a shark in the water. And they're exceptional eating. And they'll migrate up into the Chesapeake Bay and then down to the Florida in the winter. So it's water temperature driven. So if you're on the cold side of the Gulf Stream, if it's 68, 70-degree water temperature, you got a decent shot at a kingfisher or cobia if you're trolling. So it might be worth fishing. If it's 65 degrees and colder, I would probably not bother fishing because the fish are already moved south until you get to that temperature edge of the Gulf Stream. And once that water hits, 68, 70 degrees, that's when I would start fishing. If that makes any sense. But you really are going to, the Gulf Stream south is a complete different fishery than north of the Gulf Stream.
What happens when you're going through the Gulf Stream? Is that not a place to be fishing?
Oh, it's a phenomenal fishery in the Gulf Stream, and that's like the I-95 corridor of fishing, right? That's where mahi, marlin, tuna, that's what they do. They circle. I mean, if you want some interesting thing, Google like mahi migration patterns, and the University of Miami has done some phenomenal studies on it and how much they move, and they follow the Gulf Stream by and large. So I entered the Gulf Stream on our crossing at night, and it was disappointing, and it was rough, as it usually is in November. But as soon as you get to the Gulf Stream, that's phenomenal fishing, or potential, anyways. Any other questions? Do you recommend fish sonar water temp add-ons to chart plotters? That's a great question. Do you need it? No. The water temp, I think, I mean, I'm a data geek, so I like it anyways. And as a fisherman first, that's the first thing I did was drill through the bottom of my boat and put a new transducer in that had better capabilities. And the reality is, in the Eastern Caribbean, if you want to go out and catch fish, or anywhere in the Caribbean, Bahamas, that drop off from 150 feet or 100 feet down to 400 to 700 feet, that really is incredibly productive, especially on the east sides of the island. So you could read that with a bottom recorder, just like the number, but I sure like to see the bottom and see what's going on, because you could mark schools of bait. The water temperature's really important when you're fishing near the Gulf Stream. Down in the Caribbean, it's less important because it's just all hot water, right? Or, pretty homogeneous in a given area. But I would recommend it. But if you don't have it and you're like, I just want to have a chance at mahi, I would ask you what your budget is, and because it's not like a must-have. Just depends on budget, what you want to do.
Okay, well, Kevin, thank you very much. Anybody have any last minute questions they want to put out? No question is not invited, so we really encourage you to ask anything. Don't be ashamed or think it's too simple a question. But thanks very much. And sounds like we'll have to wait until the fall to to try again. But
yeah,
so,
and I would say I talked with Sheldon quite a bit about the run up to Maine, and I did that last year. And in order to, if you really want good opportunity to fish, you have to leave the Chesapeake or the Delaware and go offshore to the continental shelf drop off. And it's called the canyons. There's a bunch of cuts, but that's like 80 miles out, and then you turn on your course. So if anybody's interested in that, I could talk to you about that, but I didn't do it. I said, oh, that's not quite worth it for me. I want to get north. But there are fish, north, but they're way further offshore.
Well, we ran into a bunch of fishermen. I'm not quite sure what they were trying to catch, but they were all clumped in one area.
Yeah,
it
it could happen.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I alluded to it briefly, and I'll shut up after this. If a warm core eddy spins off the Gulf Stream, so if you had a temperature chart and you're only not that far offshore and the water temperature spiked up into like 81 degrees, it's probably a warm core eddy that spun off the Gulf Stream that could just be loaded with fish. So that's why like the fishermen off of the Northeast coast, they all subscribe to sea surface temperature charting because that's the most important indicator up north for potential fishing grounds.
okay. Well, thank you very much again. And I hope we're better prepared for our next round of fishing. And Barb, do you want to wrap things up?
Yes, well, again, thank you very much, Kevin. Great information, great photos. So if anyone has a last minute question here, get it in now for Kevin, or I think he mentioned that you can contact him if you come up with some questions later on. I will be sending the recording out so you can review this. And tomorrow we do have another webinar using the Salty Dog Comprehensive Offshore Checklist. Russ Owen, a lot of you have been with Russ Owen's presentations before, always great info there. So hope to see a lot of you there. And thank you so much, Kevin. With that, we will call it a day.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate helping.